Goldstein, who is joining us virtually. I've had the pleasure of knowing Michael and working with him for almost 20 years now. Started off with the Florida Brownfields Association, and then we actually ended up running a conference that Michael came up with a great idea of doing a conference on closed gas stations and the redevelopment of that. That's just had the tremendous opportunity to know Michael because he's a wealth of information in this arena, the whole environmental law sector. So with it, I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael, and let you make the introductions of our speakers. And hopefully we have eliminated all the glitches from this morning, and we will move forward. Thank you. Michael, it's all yours, sir.
Gene, you made me blush. Thank you so much. And hopefully the glitches will remain in the parts per trillion, right below the provisional standard. Thank you also, Gene, not only for that kind introduction, but for soldiering on and convening this conference. This is a very important forum and venue for professionals, for the agencies, for regulated parties, and there's not only a lot of learning that's going to come out of this conference, but a significant amount of action that will benefit Florida and its citizens. So thank you for that. We owe you a debt of gratitude for elevating the level of discourse and the level of expertise. I'm here to moderate today's next session, post-lunch session, PFAS regulatory issues. We have a great panel, starting with Teresa Booeshaghi, Assistant Director, Division of Waste Management, FDEP. She's going to provide a state perspective. We then will hear from Jorge Caspary, who is a principal with Cameron Cole. We heard from Jorge earlier. We're going to hear from him again. He's going to speak on water quality governance. After that, we'll hear from John Konkus, Senior Manager of Strategic Development and Government Affairs with AECOM, on the importance of public engagement, which, coming from the Brownfields world, is an issue near and dear to my heart, and one that I telegraphed in the earlier session with my question about environmental justice. And then we're going to get even near and dear to my heart with a session, with a presentation specifically addressing PFAS and Brownfields redevelopment. That's Rick Shoyer, who's a senior project consultant with Montrose Environmental. And then finally, our good friend Brad Tompa with Martian Environmental Services will be speaking on what you need to know about regulatory surface water screening levels. Okay, with that said, let's turn it over to Teresa, who is joining us from Tallahassee.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, Gene, I think we have a pre-recorded presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Teresa Booeshaghi, and I am the Assistant Director for the Division of Waste Management of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And I'm going to share with you Florida's perspective on PFAS. I apologize that I'm unable to be there with you in person, but I hope everyone there is having a great time and learning lots of information on everyone's favorite emerging contaminant. I want to start off by sharing the department's website related to our efforts addressing PFAS. Here you can find the latest information on any technical developments, as well as status of the sites the state is investigating. Additionally, you can find a copy of the department's dynamic plan, which outlines the department's current priorities with respect to PFAS, along with future potential areas of consideration. Note that our dynamic plan is a living document, so check in periodically for updates. We also provide links to resources that might be beneficial, including various fact sheets. Under the statutory authority provided in Chapters 376 and 403 Florida statutes and rules promulgated under Chapter 62-780 Florida Administrative Code, the department has developed provisional cleanup target levels. Note that I've highlighted the specific language in Chapter 62-780, Section 150, which provides for default parameters and equations to establish CTLs for pollutants, chemicals, or other substances not listed in Chapter 62-777, and the reference to implementing this provision as being enforceable. The provisional CTL for groundwater was calculated to be 70 nanograms per liter individually or combined for PFOA and PFOS. This was developed using the non-cancer GCTL equation in Chapter 62-777. Provisional soil cleanup target levels are 1.3 milligrams per kilogram for both PFOA and PFOS in a residential setting and 25 milligrams per kilogram in a commercial industrial setting. Note that the leachability numbers are quite low, with PFOA at 0.002 milligrams per kilogram and PFOS at 0.007 milligrams per kilogram. The department has also calculated irrigation well screening levels of 6.7 micrograms per liter for PFOA and 72 micrograms per liter for residential purposes, and 750 micrograms per liter for PFOA and 370 micrograms per liter for PFOS in an industrial setting. It's important to note that these are very conservative numbers for guidance purposes only and are intended to be an indicator of whether additional investigation may be necessary. The department has also developed surface water screening levels for the protection of human health related to consumption, as well as for the protection of aquatic receptors. The department coordinated with the Division of Environmental Assessment and Restoration on these numbers. It is important to note that these are screening levels and the department does not consider these numbers enforceable. So how did we get here? It's important to take a look back at history and how things have evolved for the department. Initially, the department became involved with PFAS when 3 utilities reported concentrations of PFAS above the health advisory level under the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule number 3. We will talk a little bit more about those 3 in just a moment, but it's important to note that all 3 impacted water systems have taken actions to meet federal drinking water standards. The 3 utilities identified in the UCMR sampling with concentrations above the health advisory level were Emerald Coast Utilities Authority, Zephyr Hills, and the City of Stuart. It is highly likely that in all 3 of these scenarios, AFFF is the likely source of PFAS contamination. The ECUA wells that were impacted were co-located with an airport and in an area where fire training activities reportedly occurred. There is also a fire station nearby. Note AOC number 1 located to the north and AOC number 2 on the south of the property. The Hagler well, located near the bottom of the slide, had the most significant impacts and has since been taken out of service. The McAllister well, located near the fire station, near AOC 1, also has impacts above the health advisory level, but now has a GAC filter installed. There are a number of other additional wells nearby that also utilize GAC treatment. The investigation is still ongoing. The City of Zephyr Hills impacted well was co-located with a fire station, which is believed to be the source of PFAS. The investigation is still ongoing, but a number of private wells in the area have been impacted as depicted on the map. In any instance where PFAS is identified above the health advisory level, the department works with the Department of Health to identify and sample any private wells in the area, and DEP's water supply restoration program assists with filters or hook up to a municipal supply. The City of Stuart has a large and complex PFAS plume. The investigation is ongoing, but the primary source appears to be the city's municipal fire and police safety training complex. While there are likely other contributing sources, including a nearby landfill and Martin County's Fire Rescue Administration or Emergency Operations Facility, extensive testing has been conducted by DEP, the city, and DOH. The figure on the right depicts the widespread nature of the contamination. As part of DOH's ongoing sampling of private wells in the area, they identified an area just west of US 1 with a number of private wells identified. This is the figure on the left. DOH sampled 110 wells, 61 of which were above the health advisory level. DEP's water supply restoration program worked with the City of Stewart to provide water lines to the area. The City of DEP's site investigation section is currently conducting an investigation in the south of this area to try to determine what the potential source is. And the City of Stewart is continuing to work on their investigation for the municipal fire training facility. As our education level began to grow with respect to PFAS, we became keenly aware of just how many potential sources of PFAS there were across the state. Take a minute and soak this one in. You can see there's various potential sources, and we've got on this map landfills and spray fields and biosolids and bulk storage facilities and airports and fire stations. But my guess is this still doesn't fully capture everything. So based on this, we realized that we need to focus our efforts on a subset of sites to be the most effective. And that leads us to our next slide, which is our certified fire training facilities. So knowing that AFFF seemed to be the primary source of PFAS at the 3 UCMR sites, we opted to focus on certified fire training facilities. The department received a list of 25 certified facilities from the Department of Financial Services, which houses the Fire Marshal's Office, and surveyed each facility based on their usage of AFFF and a handful of other factors, including their proximity to drinking water wells. The site investigation section completed a very cursory assessment of each facility with 1 to 2 groundwater samples and a handful of soil samples at each facility. All but 3 required additional assessment, and many have nearby private well impacts. For those facilities that are state-owned, the department has continued assessment activities, and in at least one case is beginning source removal activities. For those properties that are not state-owned, the department has issued letters indicating the facilities may be responsible for cleanup under Chapter 62780. I'm going to talk about a few of the sites that we're working on quickly for perspective. The first and probably the largest project is the Florida State Fire College in Ocala. This particular property has extensive groundwater contamination extending off-site and has impacted multiple private wells. We've installed a robust monitoring network, but aside from the groundwater contamination, there is a large area of soil contamination in an area that was used for storage of AFFF product. The drums of AFFF have reportedly been stored at this location for many years, and at least a couple of them have been leaking. The concentrations of PFOA and PFOS in soils combined in this area exceeded the provisional residential soil cleanup target level, extending down to the water table. An interim soil excavation is ongoing. As of April 20th, the department had hauled away an estimated 525 tons of soil with additional trucks slated for removal. An area of soil staining was observed that had a strong odor similar to the smell of the protein-based AFFF drums that were previously removed. Because of the high concentrations, it was treated as hazardous, largely due in part to concerns from haulers and disposal facilities. One of the complicating factors we ran into at the fire college was that DOH conducted health consultations on the college and adjacent property and for those private wells that were impacted in the areas surrounding the college. For those of you who aren't familiar with health consultation process, it's driven by an agreement between the Department of Health and ATSDR. Therefore, DOH utilizes ATSDR's values to make a determination about risk. As many of you know, the levels of PFOA and PFOS that are acceptable by ATSDR are significantly lower than DEP's provisional cleanup target level. This presents a risk communication challenge as DEP has indicated that risk is acceptable at 70 nanograms per liter, yet DOH's health consultation indicates that there is a risk to human health at much lower concentrations. I believe these health consultations are available on DOH's website still if any of you are interested in reading them. This is a real risk communication challenge that is difficult for most people to understand. I expect that this will continue to be an issue throughout the state as more sites get evaluated and additional health consultations are completed. We've also done a lot of work at the Hillsborough Community College facility in Tampa. This map shows that a number of private wells have exceedances of the health advisory level, and they are in some cases over a mile away from the site. We suspect that we likely have multiple sources contributing to the PFAS contamination. I know it's hard to see on this map, but the triangles on the map represent various types of sites: brownfields, Superfund, petroleum, or other waste cleanup sites. And you can see that there's a number of these sites within both a half a mile and a mile of the site. One of the strategies we looked at to potentially distinguish between the sources of contamination is to look at their PFAS congener ratios to determine if we could identify any similarities or differences. You can see that there is definitely some variation in the signatures. In this case, you can see that TMW1, which is located on the Hillsborough County College property, has a very different signature than those around it. But what this really tells us is hard to know. The findings are generally very chaotic, and because we know that there have been multiple product formulations that have different signatures, there's still a lot of uncertainty. It'll be interesting to see if this sort of fingerprinting will be usable in the future. We have worked with our contractor to plot these various sources and identify potential sensitive receptors like schools and daycares. As you can see, this is a real challenge when it comes to site assessment. With the number of potential sources and the low concentrations that we are looking at, I imagine this will translate into a significant issue as investigations across the state continue. In addition to the fire training facilities, the department completed a pilot project on 15 dry cleaning solvent cleanup program sites. We took groundwater samples from 2 on-site monitoring wells, ensuring that at least one was in a source area location and that the site had a long history of monitoring. 10 of the sites had concentrations above the provisional groundwater cleanup target levels. We are continuing our assessment at dry cleaning sites and have developed a prioritization for future assessment activities. Sites have been grouped into tiers based on their current assessment status, and priority will be given to those sites currently undergoing assessment. This prioritization is reflected in our dynamic plan, so if you're interested in reading more, I would encourage you to check there. In all cases, we plan to sample up to 5 monitor wells and will only proceed with further assessment if groundwater concentrations are above 70 nanograms per liter. The department also has looked at a subset of our state cleanup sites, targeting those whose operational history would potentially include PFAS. 2 groundwater samples were collected at each of the sites. 14 of the 27 sites evaluated had exceedances above the provisional groundwater cleanup target level. Additional investigation is ongoing at many of these sites. We also continue to work with a number of federal facilities across the state, some with significant impacts of PFAS. In some cases, there have been off-site private well impacts. Each branch of the services is operating differently, with some further along than others. Notable in the investigations to date has been 2 of the Navy bases, which have PFAS above the health advisory level and an on-site public water supply. Many of these investigations are still in their infancy, but we expect the number of assessments to continue to grow. I mentioned earlier about our dynamic plan, but to summarize the department's next steps and things that may be potential future considerations, I've captured the following from the plan. Our first priority is to continue identifying areas of potential or known contamination and address environmental impacts. This is really continuing to complete the assessments of the sites that we've already began investigating and to address the contamination through risk mitigation and remediation. Our second priority is to continue to prioritize and investigate likely PFAS sources. We have identified a number of potential sources across the state which merit further investigation, but let me point out that the department does not have any current plans to proceed on anything other than former fire training facilities at this time. And just to provide an overview of what the department is currently working on, I mentioned that previously that assessment continues at the state-owned fire training facilities and remediation is now underway at the Florida State Fire College. We plan to continue those assessments until each facility is fully delineated, and then we'll take appropriate steps to address the contamination. We have also started looking at some of the former certified fire training facility locations. In particular, work has begun at the former Indian River State College and the former Florida State Fire College. Similar to the survey conducted on the current fire training facilities, we sent out surveys to the 23 identified former certified fire training locations. Again, ranking based on their usage of AFFF, proximity to drinking water wells, etc. Fortunately, a number of them indicated that they did not use AFFF, but we do have a handful that are uncertain of their AFFF usage. Attached is a map of the former Indian River State College's fire assessment. We actually found the former location out through our initial investigation of the current facility. We identified PFAS in wells on site at the current facility, which triggered DOH to conduct private well sampling in the area. We found that concentrations in the private wells offsite had significantly higher concentrations than the on-site wells. After doing some homework, we discovered that the area of residential properties was the location of the former Indian River State College facility. And our investigation is still ongoing. And that's about it for what the department is working on, and I'd be happy to take any questions that the audience may have.
Teresa, thank you so much. I think what we're going to do is we're going to hold questions until the end of all of the panel presentations, and then we'll come back, and I'm sure there will be more than a few for you. All right, let's go. Thank you. That was wonderful and tremendous insight into where the department is at and where it's placing its emphasis on regulatory response and analysis. Jorge, you are up next. You are our next presenter.
Thank you, everybody. I'm Jorge Caspary and principal with Cameron Cole. And I'm going to give a different spin or perspective to what we've been discussing here. I'm going to try to mix three different elements: population growth, the availability of groundwater and quality, and what role does PFAS play in this? It's basically, I'm trying to give everybody an educational perspective. Everybody knows what PFAS are, what's going on, the extent of PFAS, but there's an element that seems to be missing from this. Water governance in Florida is big. For those of you that are Floridians, you know that there are 6 water management districts, and those control how much water gets tapped out of our aquifers. For those that are not from Florida, Florida derives 90% of its potable water from groundwater, and therefore managing our groundwater resources is very, very important. I'm going to talk a little bit about population growth, the effect on water resources, water quantity and quality, the PFAS element. What are major concerns? The existing framework of access to groundwater in Florida. It may surprise you. What are possible existing solutions? What is really beyond the horizon for our state? Is PFAS really that important? And you get an answer on that, and then some final thoughts. Oh, last Friday, I think it was revealed that our state has reached 21.5 million people. We get 1,000 net residents every day. Every day. You know, people leave the state, they get tired of the heat, but we got more people coming in than leaving. And we estimate that by the year 2025, we'll be about 23 million, and somewhere around 2030, we'll have 26 million people. This is as late as last November. What do we do for groundwater resources? Every 5 years, as you probably know, the water management districts must create what's called a regional water plan. The regional water plan, it's a very thorough effort by geologists, engineers, and planners trying to decide where is groundwater going to be coming to provide that water to us, but also to the millions of people that are going to be coming in over the next few years. And that's an important one. Where is that groundwater going to come? Without any planning, of course, you know, in collaboration of all those authorities, they estimate that Florida, the freshwater supply, is not going to be able to provide water by around 2040. I propose here that PFAS contamination is likely going to accelerate that lack of fresh water supply unless something happens. Let me put you an example. There is this institution called the Central Florida Water Initiative. It's a mix of 3 water management districts and several utilities and its stakeholders. And one of the reasons why that was created is because groundwater does not respect any political boundaries, and neither does contamination. And so these folks came together and said, look, we're in Orlando, Sanford, and that city is absolutely exploding with growth in the last 10, 15 years. Where are we going to get groundwater for these folks? So they began, a lot of smart people began to put heads together, and they developed a collaborative approach that says, well, we need to think in terms of future growth, where the water is going to come from. And usually the plan consists of developing, available water levels. How do we keep rivers maintaining the same flow? Florida has a lot of springs. Some of us use those springs for recreation. We take our kids, etc. How do we keep the minimum flows in those springs if we're going to have 3 million people or maybe 10 million people? We just don't know. Those are projections. A lot of modeling, data analysis, engineering, etc. And really we evaluate, or they evaluate, available water quantity. But one big element is missing: quality. I mean, the potential sources in general are checked for pH, total dissolved solids, and etc. But what we are finding is that there is a very disparate nature of permitting access to groundwater in the state of Florida. And there is a lack of an integrated model that will tell these water planners and everybody what portions of the aquifer may not be available for consumption in the state of Florida here in the next 10, 15 years. There's one reason why 54 water utilities are suing the manufacturers. It's because those utilities' wells are very deep and they're being impacted with PFAS. And that tells us that, utilities are going to be looking at PFAS in the next, if they're not looking already, in the next few years in terms of where do we get the water if it's impacted with PFAS. And some of that, as I said, is in deep aquifers. Permitting access to groundwater in Florida is very decentralized. It's a function usually delegated to cities and local governments with very minimal technical capacity to look at whether the aquifer where this permit is going to be requested, it's impacted. And so we're facing a problem. With PFAS assessments, and you just saw the DEP, PFAS is everywhere. And in many cases, it's very deep. I mean, in Florida, we have a confining unit. It's called the Hawthorne Formation, for those of you that are geologists, but sometimes there's really not a confining unit in the sand and gravel aquifer and the Biscayne aquifer, and those aquifers are going to be impacted. So we really lack a model. We in the state, we lack a model that tells water planners not how much quantity. I don't think we suffer from a quantity problem in Florida. We suffer from, because we suffer from a storage problem. Most of the groundwater that we get, or it gets rained off or discharged to the oceans. But also a model that tells any applicant or any people in charge of permitting groundwater access, what is the quality of water? Why are we concerned? Why should we be concerned? I mean, here we are, the very first forum on PFAS, and we're going to debate solutions, problems that we face, etc. Mainly in 2 scales, the macro and micro scale. I mean, we all expect that a regulatory framework exists to provide clean water to us, our kids, our grandkids, people that are going to be coming in. We really don't think about much when somebody moves to Florida and says, well, here it is, the water is available. There's plenty of water in Florida. So PFAS may change that expectation. Our population growth is immense. I mean, I drove yesterday from 589 from Tallahassee, and I remember 5 years ago, north of Pasco County is exploding. Everywhere you look around Pasco County, there is a development. Well, we got to provide water for those folks. But our population growth is probably going to force us to take a look at water quality as well as quantity. And on a micro scale, I mean, if we fail to improve the existing deficient regulatory framework on permitting access to groundwater, we've already learned this morning that PFAS, those two compounds and probably many others have an effect on human health. And so, we need to take care of that at a micro scale. So what is really the existing framework of permitting groundwater access in the state of Florida? It's very simple, but very ineffective. At a macro scale, basically there's very little data sharing between groundwater contamination and somebody that's going to be permitting access to groundwater. As I showed out there, maybe at a large 100,000 gallon consumptive use permit well, we'll get the appropriate vetting. But if somebody's going to install a well, a 2-inch well for irrigation, it doesn't happen. On a micro scale, access to groundwater is predicated as a very straightforward process. And sometimes it's an e-permit. It is an e-permit, and it's usually given within a week without proper vetting. And this raises many, and what we've been finding out is that it is the driller and the applicant that are supposed to be checking water quality. Let me repeat that again. It's the driller's responsibility or the applicant to ensure that the groundwater they're going to be tapping, it's of good quality. That, to me, if there's an attorney here, raises all kinds of liability questions. Is the driller liable if he failed to check the groundwater quality, or the well is going to be tapping a PFAS plume? Was the failure to notify, due diligence, etc. So what are existing solutions to this challenge that we're facing ourselves? There are a few, not many, but there are. One of them, of course, those of you that have heard me speak in summer school and other places, there's a rule in Florida that got implemented way back in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. It's called Rule 62524. And that rule requires DEP to delineate an area of groundwater contamination. Now, granted, not every plume will likely be delineated, maybe not a benzene plume in a gas station, but as we're finding out, PFAS is laterally and vertically extensive. And so it's incumbent upon DEP to go ahead and just basically delineate groundwater contamination. And what's the purpose? The purpose of that rule is to tell a water planner that groundwater is not really available for consumption unless it gets tapped at a deeper aquifer. So that rule has been in existence. It is convoluted. It's a complicated process. And just recently, the EPA began to assemble what's called an EPA water quality framework. And EPA is beginning to put all the data from groundwater, including PFAS, in a georeferenced layers to figure out how big of a problem we have across the nation, which is a titanic undertaking, but certainly in the state of Florida. So there are some solutions out there. As Teresa showed, the DEP deputy director showed that map. And why is that map important? Because at all those locations, PFAS was detected. And so from the panhandle of Florida and Pensacola to the top of the screen, all the way down to Key West down there is PFAS in the state. And we got to applaud DEP that they're trying to wrap their arms around this problem. But the deeper we dig, we realize that we are, faced with a big societal problem ourselves. And we need to do something about it for water resources. My presentation is short and, but I'll go straight to the point. So where do we go from here? What's beyond the horizon in terms of making sure that we will have access to clean water in the future, but also we can sustain the growth that we're having in the state? I mean, Florida, after all, is a state that thrives on growth. And if we don't have access to good quality water, then growth stops. We are, in many cases, a one-trick pony. We depend on growth, construction. I think we need to start working on a better paradigm. Right now we have a dysfunctional system. The caption right there, the cartoon reads, our biggest challenge is the time zone difference in New York. It's 2:45, but our headquarters is 1974. Right now it's 1:30 here, but we're working on a paradigm that's decades old and it hasn't kept up. But what does PFAS does is just brings that to the fore in terms of bringing water quality into the planning. Is PFAS really that important? Yes. I believe PFAS changes everything, everything. In terms of not only assessment, potential remediation alternatives that exist right now, which are extractive, not really in situ destruction, but also in terms of making sure that what do we know, how extensive these plumes are, and how are they going to affect future water resources. I think some of the solutions are, we need to develop a better model that unifies very disparate regulations. Those regulations also need to facilitate the engagement of local entities in the resolution. Local governments, environmental justice groups need to be participating in this because everybody counts on clean and good quality water, not just water quantity, but quality. Improved coordination and data sharing between agencies and local governments. We're finding out that there are very, very serious deficiencies in data sharing. Certainly, if somebody goes to apply for a permit to access a well, likely it's up to you to figure out whether that well, it's going to be tapping a contaminated plume. As of right now, there isn't a data point that can tell you where that is if you go for a permit. Imagine a rural area that has a closed factory adjacent to an environmental justice neighborhood. They're out of luck. So this is a multi-dimensional problem. I believe we need a better spatial management system, a GIS-based system to tell us where these plumes are. And I think we'll get there, but it's a process that must happen because we're still stuck in 1974. We need training. We need to train the people that are reviewing these permit applications to access groundwater. They're not trained. They're, for the most part, mid to low level staff in cities and local governments that don't look at the applications. It's just a rubber stamp. If they're telling us that the water quality depends on you, the applicant, then we have a problem. And yeah, we need funding. And this is an issue that requires funding. It does require funding to address this issue because ultimately we cannot go on like this. It's an issue that's going to affect us tremendously. I got a few final thoughts. As I said, my presentation is more educational than anything else, but highlights a problem that we are going to be facing, or we are facing already in terms of water resources, quantity and quality. I'll tell you this, that regulatory response actions are looming. Tell your clients to be ready if you work for a landfill operator, a city, a fire department, an airport, a seaport. Chances are at some point in time, the department is going to be looking at all of you as it was pointed out in their PFAS dynamic plan. Nobody's excluded because everybody has used these substances. Our state's not going to stop growing. We know people love Florida. There was a gentleman this morning that came from Detroit, where there's 2 feet snow and everybody's still wearing parkas. We're not here. Everybody loves Florida. The state's not going to stop growing. If we are here, nope, we love it here. Newcomers will need water, but they will need water that's clean and good quality. And right now, PFAS presents a big dilemma. I think a lot of hard work is being put to ensure adequate supplies are available, but quantity or quality are vastly different. Yes, we don't have a quantity problem. We have a storage problem in Florida. We don't know where we're going to store future sources of groundwater. But if we're going to store them in aquifers that are already impacted, that's a big problem. Laws, rules, policy developments, they have to evolve to advance what we all here know, that PFAS is a big problem. those rules have not kept up with the times. They're stuck in the long past. They need to come up, or the state will hurt, no matter how much we want to grow and how much we want to have clean water. And yes, the rules and guidance and probably laws have to incorporate PFAS to the equation. It's just too big of a problem to ignore. I mean, it's everywhere. I ultimately believe that the failure to incorporate water quality, specifically PFAS, these long, large plumes a mile down the source, regardless of what was the source, will mean conflict. You know, I don't know if you remember, I was in college at the time, but at some point in time here in Tampa, we had what's called the water wars. In essence, Tampa began to run out of water. So they went to different counties to get water, and those counties said, I'm not gonna give you water. That's my water. And so that kind of put the stop and created a compact of several counties that came together and collaboratively worked. It's called Tampa Bay Water. But if we don't address this issue of water quality for future water supplies, there is going to be conflict, because those folks that do have clean water, are they going to be willing to release it to folks that don't have it? And I grant you, you can go ahead and extract groundwater out and filter it to activated carbon, but eventually those costs become prohibitive. And who bears those costs? Us. So is it really fair, that we are going to be, saddled with, perpetual costs to filter groundwater for PFAS? I don't know. I mean, that's a question that, some people need to respond. For some, it may be fair. Yeah, I'm willing to pay more for clean water. Good for you. Some people are going to say, no, I shouldn't be saddled with those costs for filtering, water. I think the city of Stewart, I don't know, I spoke with somebody from the city of Stewart, is spending millions on activated carbon, and all 3 wells are impacted. Again, if we don't address this from a more policy and looking ahead in the horizon perspective, and the role that PFAS plays in our state in terms of groundwater access, we will have conflict and very, very expensive solutions to address down the road. And, can we afford those solutions? Debatable. I mean, are we willing to pay more property taxes? Are we willing to pay more for utility rates? That's the big question in front of us. We need to incorporate PFAS. Yes, it's a very important aspect. We need to incorporate PFAS in the water resource planning, because otherwise we're going to be heading for disaster here. Thank you.
Jorge, thank you. That presentation was excellent. You've now elevated my anxiety level to the 11th degree. And it's interesting, and I'm glad that John is coming up next to talk about public engagement, because there is a logical, emotional progression in this conference to date. The earlier sessions highlighted what we know intuitively from recent experience as professionals as the complexity of all of these matters and the lack of certainty and uniformity with respect to source, assessment methodology, remediation technology. And then we move on to Jorge's second presentation that just concluded. And what resonates with me is his unique turn of the phrase, the looming regulatory response that as yet is unknown in scope and nature. And so now, and then we're professionals. So we have uncertainty, we have complexity, and we have anxiety. Put yourself in the shoes of the public who aren't trained in these issues. And I think that the emotional progression here transitions to abject fear. And that underscores the importance of public engagement. And that's where John is going to take things forward.
Thank you, Michael. Please? That's the best segue I could have asked for. Checks in the mail. 1974 was a great year, I have to say, for some of us. But my name is John Konkus. So as you can see, I'm Government Affairs Strategic Development lead for AECOM here in the state of Florida, and do geopolitical work for our company and our clients across the entire business. But for the purposes of this presentation, let's think about my immediate former role, where I was the Deputy Associate Administrator for the Office of Public Affairs at EPA, which in normal English means I ran the communications office for the agency during the first 3 years of the Trump administration before joining before joining AECOM. And in that role, and during that time, I helped develop this document here, which has been widely referenced all morning and afternoon long. This is the EPA PFAS action plan from February of 2019. Of course, it's on their website, but limited edition print copy here that I like to keep at my desk. As Michael was saying, you know, PFAS obviously impacts human health. And part of what we did at EPA in developing this document was address that point head on and say that we were going to make public engagement a main component of our PFAS approach. And this is really the first time EPA ever took a stab at addressing PFAS, which, has been pointed out, has really been with us as an issue for decades. And in fact, you can see right here in the very introduction that the action plan was developed in associations with communities, industry groups, associations, and the public. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that and hope that it could serve as a window into how I believe personally people that are charged with addressing this issue, like we all are in this room, need to really appreciate the impact it has on individuals and families that have to deal with PFAS in their communities. My presentation, really, when I first sent the slide deck over to Gene, was going to be a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of public engagement and communications 101, because I thought, well, you know, this is a great document. I like it. I helped write it. I think it's fantastic. But it is from the last administration. And what's the relevance now, all these years later? And I was helped by a press release from the current EPA administrator this past week, Michael Regan, and he established this PFAS, new PFAS council, which I think was spoken briefly about earlier. But the beauty of this press release is, and the beauty of the Biden administration's EPA PFAS policy, is that they, namely, are endorsing this document. So this is a very rare point of agreement between the prior administration and the current administration, but it says it right here. The agency's ongoing, this is the Biden administration's press release from Tuesday, the agency's ongoing work on PFAS is based on the 2019 EPA PFAS action plan and continues the close interagency coordination and coordination with local communities. And so I take that as a point of pride because we helped write this, but also it should be a message really to hopefully the American people that are dealing with this issue, that as much politics as there is out there in the world today, that we can all agree this is an issue that needs to be addressed, hopefully by everybody with as little politics as possible. Now, I'm a scientist of a different kind. I'm a political scientist, so to say that there's not politics involved would be completely naive. And we can talk about that to the extent that you're interested in doing that. But let's go in, and Michael, I'll also address as part of the overview of how we developed the public engagement part of this document, I will address your question about environmental justice communities to the extent that we looked at that in the development of the PFAS action plan. So how did this document, which we now know has been endorsed by the Biden administration, how did this document come to be, and how did EPA decide that public engagement was going to be a forerunner of the actual document? So, you know, 90% of this is science, 10% is public engagement, and asking the community and engaging with the community. So first things first, we all sat down at the table in the EPA administrator and his top officials, both career scientists and political appointees like myself. And we decided that we were going to hit this thing head on. Now, of course, it is different as the regulator than being the regulated community. And frankly, it's probably a lot easier as the regulator to drive a public engagement strategy because, you don't really have the same risk concerns that you would, of course, as a regulated entity. You know, risk communications has several different definitions. For most in this room, it's probably risk of litigation. But for EPA, it was, and the same for DEP, risk communications is, what are the risks? How are we going to communicate the risks that we know and what we don't know to the public, right? And so we decided that we were going to, in fact, say, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. And this is exactly some of the presentation that we heard earlier from some of our scientists. Hey, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what we're doing in order to try to find the answer. And so with that as our general spectrum, we decided we were going to do 2 major public engagement activities in order to start engaging the variety of stakeholders and the public and elected officials across the country. And the first thing we did is we decided we were going to have a PFAS summit. So in the spring of 2018, we held the very first ever PFAS summit, not unlike this, but we held it in Washington, D.C. in the EPA building. And we invited literally everybody. I mean, we invited every governor, every elected official from, you know, county commissioner up to U.S. senator, every water agency, every NGO, you name it, we invited them, and many of them showed up. So this is the roster of people that showed up. You know, several hundred people and organizations came to this summit. So we held it over 3 days. The EPA administrator himself led it, and it was obviously there's some structure to it, but it was a free-for-all. Let's hear what's happening in your community. What are your scientists telling you, Michigan? What, New York, right? U.S. Senator so-and-so, what do you have to say about it? And kind of get all of everything onto the table, right? Everything onto the table. And then as the EPA, it's our job at that point to take the information and start disseminating it with what we know, what we're learning, and start building a document. The next thing we did after that is we went on the road, and we went directly to the communities that were most, that we believed were most impacted by PFAS at the time. So this is now the summer of 2018. So we had our EPA, our EPA summit, where we had kind of a high level group come in, give us their input. Now we're going to go to the road and talk to the people in the community, right? And so we chose 5 communities: Exeter, New Hampshire, Horsham, Pennsylvania, Colorado Springs, Colorado, Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Leavenworth, Kansas. Now, there's a similarity there if you follow it, and a lot of it has to do with Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has locations very close to or in these communities that tended to be the focal point of the concern about PFAS. These communities were the ones that had more public, I want to call it press activity, but it was more than that. It was public input. It was letter writing. It was their members of Congress were involved in ringing our phone off the hook. And so we just understood these were the areas where the biggest focus was. And so, Michael, to your question about environmental justice communities, quite frankly, these communities here, Exeter, New Hampshire, anybody who's familiar with the seacoast of New Hampshire, Horsham, Pennsylvania, if you're familiar with Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, Colorado Springs, Colorado, those 3 in particular are quite the opposite of what you might think of as an environmental justice community. These are fairly wealthy, upper income communities. Montgomery County, Pennsylvania in particular is a very wealthy community. And so the question about, as you see with some other type of environmental activities like brownfields and Superfund sites that happen to be vastly more located in typical environmental justice communities, some of these communities are not what you might consider the typical environmental justice community. On that point, I'm going to take a little detour here and say Ocala, Florida, and to the south of the Fire College, for those that are familiar with Marion County, is an environmental justice community. It is a very high level of low to moderate income as defined by HUD. And there's a very large African-American community in that area of Marion County. So I think that that's an example of is rural, granted, but it does get into a little bit more urban just south of there in the city of Ocala. So I think that's more the traditional environmental justice concern that you might get some attention in that area. So we went to these communities. Now, what does it look like when you hold a community engagement in Exeter, New Hampshire, for example? So I'll use that as our first example. That was the very first community engagement EPA has ever done on PFAS. So what we did is we went to the local high school in Exeter, New Hampshire, and we rented it, essentially the auditorium, for 3 days. And we went there with honestly no objective other than we give an upfront presentation from our scientists, EPA scientists. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. This is what we're doing. Now let's hear from you, right? And so everybody in town, the news media can ask a question. Anybody can ask any question they want. There's no limit, time limit. There's no clock monitoring you. We go into as late at night until people are exhausted, and we come back the next morning and do it again. And the reason we did that is because this is not, for us, it was not a check the box exercise. This is, we're going to take public engagement and we're going to integrate it into our document. This is what people are concerned about, right? In fact, you can see that come to real life right here in the document when we have our actions, right? Here's our action list. In the very first column says stakeholder concern, right? This is the thing that's driving the answer, the stakeholder concern. What's going to happen to my child? What's going to happen to my community? Is our school safe? These types of things that everyday people are concerned about. There's a question DEP or an issue DEP brought up about having two different sets, right? And that was also spoken about in the scientific section before lunch, having two different sets of variables by which you're judging health risk. So we had to deal with that as well, because the Department of Defense uses the ATSDR criteria, which is a less stringent criteria than what EPA uses. And EPA uses a criteria that's less stringent than what a state might use. So how do we deal with that? We said, this is what we're using. This is how we got there. And we invited DOD and ATSDR to come. Now that's a little bit of something that you can do if you're EPA that you might not be able to do if you're a state, for example, but DOD felt obliged, if you will, to join EPA at these events where every TV camera in a 300-mile region was focused and you had 1,000 people in the crowd. That made sense for DOD, whose base was the object of the issue, to show up and explain why they use the ATSDR number. So we have that conversation. Is it a challenge? Yes. Is it an easy answer? No. But are you better off because now you understand why EPA uses their number and why DOD uses their number? Are you a more educated consumer? Yes, you are. So those types of conversations, while they're difficult and they don't give all the answers, believe it or not, it is quite satisfactory to people to have that opportunity. And that's one of the lessons I learned right offhand, because I have the same concern that FLDEP has, which is, gosh, we have these two different numbers. It's such a challenge. It is. But you would be so surprised about the response you get from average people who say, thank you. I didn't know that's how it was done. Now I know how it's done. Now I can make a better decision for my family. Or now I can read the paper and have a better understanding of what's going on. So just having that interaction, having the explanation given to them in a setting where you're actually communicating with them one-on-one is completely invaluable. So we did that over and over again, 5 times across the country. And along with our National Leadership Summit, we integrated that with our science, and we came up with our PFAS action plan, which is now actually has a second iteration that came out in the spring of last year. So there's an update to this. And I'm certain that the new administration will update it as well, which is great. I'm very encouraged by the Biden administration's inclusion of PFAS, Jorge, into the American Jobs Act. So we talk about having the resources necessary to address it. According to President Biden, he wants to put billions of dollars behind it. You know, an infrastructure bill is fixing PFAS infrastructure. I sure think it is. It's water infrastructure, so I'm rooting for that. And I think those are promising things. I think it's promising that the PFAS action plan, which has an incredible amount of public input built into it, is still considered the gold standard by which public engagement will be carried forward at EPA. And I think it's worthwhile case study for those of you who are going to be potentially doing, or have clients that are interested in doing community outreach and community engagement to go back and look at, because I think it's the gold standard. And it's not just me saying that, it's two ideologically different presidential administrations now saying it. And they're saying it for a reason, because we followed the basic core principles of communication and we put the public first. So that's the story behind why public engagement is important from my perspective. And of course, be happy to take questions at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. That was excellent and a very nice segue from the technical side of the panel. We move from the technical to the risk communication to the environmental redevelopment, which I know a lot of us are involved in. It has legal issues, regulatory considerations, financial considerations, and more. Rick, I see you're at the podium. Okay. We look forward to hearing from you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully your sugar level hasn't dropped too low right now. My name's Rick Shoyer. I'm with Montrose Environmental. In addition to being a licensed site remediation professional and a industrial wastewater licensed operator in New Jersey, I'm also the president of the Brownfield Coalition of the Northeast. And I am excited to announce that the Region 4 TAB team of ICMA, that our organization will be providing technical assistance for the Brownfields EPA TAB Region 4, as well as the work that we do in Regions 1 through 3. So very excited about that. And we're going to try to move along here. Okay. Thank you. So looking at brownfield and brownfield redevelopment, redevelopment is fairly straightforward. When we start adding brownfields to it, they start getting a little more complicated. And then when we add PFAS, we get tied up into a big knot and not sure what to do about it. So what I'm going to try to cover here real quickly are these 6 items. And I'm going to have to go through them rather quickly, but just to give you a quick idea of what I'm going to try to cover. So my first introduction to PFAS was quite some time ago, and it actually was just PFOA. I looked at PFOA and what I knew about it and said, well, it looks like MTBE, a gasoline contaminant, one compound. It didn't like soil, really wasn't volatile, and liked groundwater and was usually leading a plume. Well, then we went to about 5,000 PFAS compounds and a whole lot of other things, and really changed that criteria. But keeping in mind that it's not volatile for the most part, so it's not an indoor air issue. For the most part, it doesn't like the soils, so it's going to go through those. So they're really in the groundwater, and most of our brownfield sites aren't going to have potable water and things from them. So in some aspects to it, it really shouldn't make it that much complicated. The interesting thing is that, the major source is ingestion. We found PFAS in all 7 continents, so it's not necessarily the drinking water that got there, and we don't have these chemical plants in all 7 continents. 98% of us have it in our blood. And with the conversation that was earlier today on toxicity, that a lot of different numbers that go into it, but one of them was the calculations that only 20% of your PFAS intake source is from drinking water. So 80% is coming from other things that we really don't know where it's coming from. And then based on the other conversation this morning, for my weight loss program, maybe I need to add a little more PFOA, and that'll help me with that process. So under the federal and state uncertainties that come along with the PFAS, we've talked about there's no MCL, so that can make it difficult. Over 50% of our states now have promulgated some form of a standard or a limit or proposed for either soil, groundwater, or surface waters. Some changes that I think are really going to affect over the next year, the toxicity release inventory, which is going to come out. The first reports are due July 1st, and that's for the year 2020 for manufacturers that handle anywhere of 172 different PFAS compounds. Now, it was mentioned earlier that that limit is on 100 pounds per year per compound, and so that may limit it. But it still is going to be a big place where people are going to be able to start looking of who's using where PFAS and who may be then discharging. In addition to that, the advance notice proposed rulemaking for PFAS manufacturers and formulation, that is out for review. It's May 16th is a review period, and that's going to require these types of manufacturers, producers, people that use the compounds have to start sampling for their wastewater. Again, it's going to be a highlight or a limelight onto those people. It's going to end up showing places where it can go for your wastewater treatment plants, which then of course is biosolids. And we've been looking at, some of the major sources, and of course, wastewater treatment plants is one of the major sources. The other one it's going to be is the fifth unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. That'll be from 2023 to 2025. Now that's 29 PFAS compounds. So we went from 6 with the UCMR 3 to now we're going to be at 29, including Gen X. We have new methods. So we haven't really talked about that in this conference so far, but maybe come up. The new method 533, which targets 25 compounds and more on the shorter chain than the 537.1, which was more on your longer chain compounds. We have more that are methods being developed for air and other types of biosolids and sediments. So those are all going to be coming with more and more limits. The PFAS interim guidance for destruction and disposal came out. It was interesting. It really didn't talk about any limits or different things, and basically said, okay, landfill and incineration. The conversation earlier this morning when it went through and talked about what it would take for PFAS to migrate through the air. My calculation is a little bit simpler. If I have 1 liter of a solution that has 1% of PFOA, that's 10,000 milligrams in that 1 liter. If I'm a hazardous waste incinerator, my regulation says to treat to 4 nines, 99.99. So if I do that and that goes through, and in New York State, the drinking water standard for PFOA is 10 part per trillion. If that extra PFOA that goes out the stack lands in the lake next door, I can now contaminate 10 million liters of PFOA in that lake from that 1 liter that I treated to 4 nines. So we still have a ways to go, and air is certainly one of the major ways that we're looking for distribution. Liability protection. Okay, there's basically 4 that I consider major ones. You have your federal circular, you have your state brownfield program. So all those, if you're in a brownfields program, has some sort of then liability protection if you go through their program. The other one is to stay outside of those and do commercial pollution, limited liability policies, and then indemnification, getting indemnification from the people that you're buying the property from or developing that they never used it or didn't have it or would be able to maintain some kind of liability if it was. So under circular, you basically have your 3 major processes, you're bona fide, you're innocent, and you're contiguous property. Okay, so those are the three that basically under the CERCLA program that you would go. Under the federal CERCLA liability protection, a couple of things you have to maintain, and you have to do certain things correctly up front to be able to get that protection. So some language that's in there that lawyers love to spend a lot of time on. All appropriate inquiries. What does that really mean? Especially when we have people doing phase ones for $2,500, giving them 4 or 5 weeks. They don't get to do the real due diligence, those types of things to it. You also, in the phase one here, they throw in that you have to recognize that or make a statement that disposal of like emerging contaminants, substances occurred prior to acquisition. And the last one is you got to make sure you're not doing anything to make the problem worse. So if you did have soils and they used to be covered and you change your development and now water washes through it and you exacerbate contamination, you could then actually be liable. Under the state brownfields programs, every state is different. And you have to know the state that you're working in and get to understand what they cover and what they don't cover. A couple of things is a lot of states will tell you that you need to address emerging contaminants. They've added that language in a number of them to what's the definition of address? Does it mean you need a sample, or do you need to just basically figure out and say, I don't think they used it, or what did you do? So again, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to sample, but you need to address it. Some states have now sampling requirements. Some states, like New Jersey, a number of others that have limits, that then you have to actually report to those. If you find things above it, you now have to continue with your investigations, go through a program for cleanup. And then there's investigative and reporting requirements associated with all of the different brownfield programs. The other way, and I have a lot of attorney friends that rely heavily on the commercial insurance and an indemnification for it. And basically they all fall under a pollution limited liability policy. They call it the same thing. They are totally different. You don't know how good your policy is until you have to use it, right? But you better really delve into it, and you can negotiate the language in the policies. So the same name, totally different policies, first party, third party, indemnifications, unknowns, some knowns. You can negotiate or do all of it depending on who the broker is. We'll try to drive how or what you might have to do to give them additional information to get a better price on your policy. One of my favorite quotes, though, from one of the brokers is, "Money can buy anything." I forgot to ask him whether or not he was happy, but I figured if nothing else, I knew through him, he could make some of my clients happy. And then the indemnification language is the last one. So again, you can get indemnification language from people to help remove your liability. So sample or not to sample. So again, here's some of my favorite quotes. "Oh yeah, we're sampling. We are not going to make this into a science project. We are sampling if there was a fire." Really interesting. Some people still just think if we had a fire, that's the only place we're going to have PFAS. "We are sampling if there's a military base or fire training facility nearby." My question is then why? I already know I've got an upgradient source. I got a source that's a much bigger pocket than me. I'm not sure I want to be sampling then. All I'm going to do is spend money telling them, you know, that, hey, I found contamination and I think it's from up the road. It is ubiquitous, so I'm sampling. Okay, so I know it's going to find it, and I'm going to sample, and now what I'm going to have to deal with it. And if I sample, I know I'll find it, so I'm not going to sample. So those are things that I get from the different people that I deal with between brokers, consultants, and attorneys. One of the things that I really say is before you sample, I really have to say, what am I going to do with the result? And I have sampled too many places where I found it, and I spend a lot of time then trying to justify and finding the upgradient source and that it wasn't them. So the investigative challenges. So there's a whole number of different things here. So this is a brownfield site. Where would you sample? You walk on this site. You got two large smokestacks back there. So if the wind is blowing from left to right and the groundwater is going from right to left, I go up to my groundwater to the right to get my upgradient. Well, guess what? That's going to be clean, right? I go downwind, right? And what am I going to find? I'm going to find a whole lot more, right? Contamination. So, which is actually your upgradient, source. I'm sorry, the way I said that backwards. So you go up upwind, you find it, your groundwater. So you turn around and say, oh, it's not me, right? Because it was your upgradient well, but it really is the source from the smokestack. So when you're doing these things, we have mass source areas where we had precursors and they haven't gone to the more stable compounds. We go to another place, we find now the higher concentration of PFOA or PFOS, and it's not really the source. It's because we didn't look at precursors and other standards in it. And then we'll talk about, some of these other issues. Just a couple of things. If you are going to sample, sometimes you want to add to your sampling program specific compounds that you may know that are in the area that are known to be target different industries, right? So here's just a couple of different ones. So right away, then, if you're looking not only for the PFOA and PFOS, let's say the only two you're really regulated for, but if you look for some of these other things that might give you additional proof that it's not your site and somebody else's, then you can look for those. The question is a lot of times, should you ever sample for things that aren't regulated, right? The compounds. And there are reasons to sample for the whole suite and even more for the PFAS, because as you can see here, I have two very different patterns for the PFAS that is known in a very same area. And I know that from this, I'm dealing with different sources. If I only looked at PFOA and PFOS, all I would know is that basically I have the same concentrations potentially and have exceedances, and I don't get this fingerprint. Last, professional judgment, okay? And who has the most liability? So for me, licensed site remedial professional, I've got to make determinations. Am I going to sample? Am I not? I've got to justify what I'm doing. If somebody comes in after me and samples and they find PFAS, is my judgment wrong or am I negligent? And so you have to be due diligent in what you're doing with the ubiquitous and what we saw earlier in presentations for PFAS through the airstream. It makes it very difficult to just look at your own little source, your own little property, and determine whether or not it's really you. But that's what I have real quick. So conclusions, yes, we can still do brownfields. We can do it with PFAS. You've got to understand your liability protection. You got to understand your team. You want to find out what's important to them and how they're going to get the liability protection. So you got to know your client. You understand the challenges in investigating, right? And then you've got to make sure if you're signing off that you've documented how you came to the conclusions that you came to either sample or not sample. And with that, I thank you very much and turn you over to our last speaker for this session.
Rick, thank you so much. A few words before we ask Brad to begin delivering his remarks. The observation about the availability of environmental insurance. From what I'm seeing in my practice, and I know some of the other environmental lawyers are as well, this is an issue that we can address in the next session. The market for environmental insurance is tightening, and that's primarily being driven by this very specific issue. We are seeing underwriters being highly reluctant to provide coverage for PFAS, even in the absence of documentation of any such impacts. And then in terms of renewals, it's also very difficult to secure extended PFAS coverage, even if it wasn't excluded in the first instance. That's number one. And then the other point I'll make is this, hearkening back to a comment that Jorge made earlier in the panel, in that this changes everything. And we are seeing a significant concern among very sophisticated private sector developers who would otherwise be willing to take on extraordinary risk. And they are also trimming their sails as a result of the uncertainty associated with this issue. So having said that, let's proceed with the final presentation of this panel, which should leave us with plenty of time for questions and answers. Brad, what do we need to know about regulatory surface water screening levels?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because there is a lot. But first, in full disclosure, my name is Brad Tompa. I am a geochemist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I am a technical advisor for PFAS projects. However, in full disclosure, I'm not here as a representative of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Therefore, everything I say is on me. So yes, surface water. As Teresa touched on earlier, and actually this is really good because I'll tie on some of everybody's presentations with my little presentation here about surface water. Oh, sorry. There we go. So as Teresa mentioned, Florida provisional screening levels for surface water and the Florida dynamic plan, which is really good. So basically these aren't enforceable, but we do have some surface water standards, 0.5 micrograms per liter for PFOA, PFOS 0.01 micrograms per liter. And it's based on consumption it was calculated, these numbers were calculated based on fish consumption. So, you know, we have the 70 parts per trillion drinking water provisional standard, but this is calculated based on consumption of fish. So we do have some standards, ecological standards for freshwater, marine, and that's about it. So thank you. No, you know, so one interesting thing is that these were calculated based on probabilistic risk. So it's a little bit more realistic for the people consuming them. And let's see. Yeah, and the way these numbers were calculated were based on a white paper done by the University of Florida. The references there at the bottom. So the University of Florida contract, it was DEP contracted University of Florida, as they often do, to come up with these numbers. So University of Florida did a very good job calculating some risk numbers for surface water and put it out there for public comment. And so the industry response was quite interesting. One of the biggest responders was waste management. Interestingly enough, why would waste management be worried about surface water? But some of the problems they had with the way the numbers were calculated was, you know, the reference dose wasn't based on the proper type of animal. I think the calculations used mice. They said you shoot monkeys or rabbits. Relative source contribution should be lowered. That's the other exposure you get from just living. Fish ingestion rate was not really based on Florida fish ingestion. It was based on some surrounding areas. So they argued that wasn't realistic of Florida. And the water to fish bioaccumulation factors they used were from fish outside of the area of Florida. So there were some shortcomings to the calculations, but they were good calculations. So the industry, you know, proposed, waste management proposed a little bit higher standards for surface water. DEP is currently in the middle of a fish consumption survey. Apparently it was kind of postponed for COVID to get a better handle on how much fish is actually consumed in Florida by the local residents. So you can see the waste management numbers they calculated, and they actually spent quite a bit of effort. They actually had several firms they subcontracted to do this calculation. They also did the similar calculation for the state of Massachusetts, who is also developing some surface water numbers, and they use the same calculations for Florida, or the same arguments and same reference documents for Florida. These are available on the DEP website if you're interested to look at them. So in the environment, what are we actually seeing in surface water? Well, there was a recent paper done by Q. It's the references at the bottom of current state, toxicity of PFAS, what we know in Florida, where are the shortcomings. They did a very good job of summarizing other research. And basically what they're finding is that, look, we are seeing PFAS and PFOS in species surrounding waters of Florida. Even in the near shore coastal environments, we're seeing it in the livers. We're seeing it in dolphins in Sarasota Bay. We're seeing it in alligators near Cape Canaveral. So we are seeing this actually in the environment. So that, you know, and where I want to go with this talk is, one, we need to be diligent about how we're going to proceed with this, but we also, as some of the panelists have talked about, is like we need to move forward with some regulatory guidance to prevent Florida from being the state that says, yeah, come here and fish, but don't eat the fish. So fate and transport. So we see it, you know, it's in the surface water. Obviously, it's getting into the biota in the inland waters. And the reason is, as many people I'm sure has talked through the day, PFAS is everywhere. PFAS compounds, there's, you know, I've seen anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 different PFAS compounds. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts, but some of the highlights, you know, it's mobile, it bioaccumulates, which may be why we're seeing it in higher concentrations in bottlenose dolphins, because they're eating smaller fish. It has a head and a tail with different charges, not the fish, but the molecules of PFAS. It's hydrophobic, fluorinated, alkyl chain at one end, a functional group at the other. It behaves very strangely. We're still learning how it behaves. Precursors, we're seeing that precursors are breaking down and forming PFOA, PFOS. What I'm going to talk about in a minute is effluent, influent. Actually, we're seeing, if you measure the influent of a wastewater treatment plant, 9 times out of 10, the effluent from a wastewater treatment plant has higher concentrations of PFOS than what was going in. So it's getting broke down by either biodegradation or some processes inside the wastewater treatment plant, which is lots of fun to try to figure that out. It sticks, but it's mobile. It likes to adhere to solids for a period of time. Then it releases from solids. Branch chain versus straight chain behave differently. You know, for a while we're saying, oh, we can look at the straight chain and tell who made it. We can look at the branch chain and tell who made it. We can look at ratios of your groundwater and tell you whose is whose. Well, we just had a briefing with the other company I work for that says, you know what, we're realizing that the branch chain adheres to organic particles much better than the straight chain. So we're seeing a differential movement of the plumes just within the chain length or the chain type. So it's confusing how we're going to evaluate whose is whose, if that's a concern for the attorneys. Another interesting thing is that this compound, it accumulates at the soil, at the air-water interface. Because of its properties, the molecules will actually accumulate right at the interface of the air and the water. And that may have implications in how you sample. It may have implications in where you sample, and how it behaves. It may also help for remediation activities to help determine new ways to remediate this. So primary sources, we see it's in the surface water. Where's it coming from? Well, and I just listed a few of them. that I thought were the biggest and that are kind of consensusly the biggest. Runoff from AFFF use, but again, yeah, there are areas where AFFF was used, but there's not, not a daily thing. Landfill leachate, because of what was disposed of in landfills, is a huge contributor for PFAS. Biosolids from land application, and wastewater treatment plants. So when I've talked to wastewater treatment plants, they go, oh, we're not a primary source. We are just a receiver. And that's true. So we have to evaluate how we're going to look at wastewater treatment plants. They just can only process what they get. One thing about PFAS, it's really an amazing chemical. That's why it's everywhere, in landfill leachate, because there's so many things that went into a landfill that have PFAS. I mean, each of us in our daily lives, daily contact something with PFAS in it, whether it's your waterproofing for your jacket, or whether it's your carpet, or whether it's your stain resistant seats in your car, you're in contact with PFAS daily. So it's still around us. I don't want to go into the new versions of PFAS, which are the shorter chains, which we're still trying to figure out what's going on with the C4 to C6 chain of fluorinated compounds, which we're still trying to figure out how those behave. So those are your primary sources. And I want to look at primary biosolids, because to me, this is the one that I think we're going to have to deal with. Because we all flush our toilet, everybody generates waste. All the waste goes to wastewater treatment plants. They have to do something with the biosolids. Greater than 50% of wastewater treatment plant sludge is land applied. So right now, if you look at statewide regulations or nationwide regulations, Maine is the only state that has application limits for PFAS. That's the only state that actually says, okay, if you're going to land apply the stuff, you have to test it and make sure it meets these standards. And the reason is because I said it loves to stick, but it loves to move. So it loves to adhere to the biosolids in the wastewater treatment plant. It sticks to them, but then you land apply them, and guess what? The stuff is releasing and going down into the groundwater, into the soil, running off into the surface water. It's moving again. Yeah, as I say, PFOA leaches more rapidly than PFOS. Topsoils have higher retention because of the clay. We're starting to learn stuff about this. Once in the vadose zone, it absorbs and accumulates on the interfaces. It can become volatilized. The stuff does volatilize into the air. It does migrate. There was one study I read where they measured rainfall. Rainfall in a rural area had 20 parts per trillion PFAS in it. So we're seeing this stuff move around in the environment, quite frankly. I mean, we find it in Antarctic. Precursors in the biosolids transform into PFOA, PFOS, which is the ones we're looking for at present in Florida. So it has a very complex structural identity. Transport is becoming difficult to evaluate, but we know it moves, we know it's in biosolids. So the problem that we have with all this land application of biosolids is that we really need to look at that. We need to evaluate that. Matter of fact, Florida has new biosolids rules under evaluation, and there's no mention of PFAS in it. And I think that's kind of a huge mistake, because I think this is the perfect opportunity to come in there and say, okay, you know what? We know biosolids are a huge source. We need to evaluate them. We need to look at them to protection of the groundwater and surface water. And these are some of the reported concentrations. And I've actually talked to multiple utilities, and they said, oh, there's just no data on that. We don't think that's an issue because there's no data. Well, I beg to differ. This is from an EPA report the EPA dynamic plan, where they evaluated concentrations in biosolids over the years. So if you look at the numbers, what do you think? I looked at it first and said, oh, okay, those don't look too bad. And then I looked at the units. It's nanograms per gram. So 1 nanogram per gram is 1,000 ppt. So these are very big numbers if you look at parts per trillion. If you look at these numbers and evaluate what's going to leach out of them into the surface water, into the groundwater, you have a huge potential to move the stuff around. Yeah, the note at the bottom, I did want to touch on the precursors and other compounds. You know, I know we focus on PFOA and PFOS, but the other huge thing we're seeing, and some states are looking at, Michigan included, Michigan is actually regulating 5 PFAS compounds now, because they understand that those 5 compounds are precursors that break down. And I think that's something we also have to evaluate is which compounds are going to break down and cause the problems. And I want to look at briefly other states. Michigan, I love Michigan. I looked at Michigan's program, how they do it. They have kind of an aggressive program. They have surface water, drinking water standards. They have surface water, non-drinking water standards. But they also have a very aggressive way they're handling this. They're requiring all their POTWs to implement an IPP program that evaluates all their waste coming into the wastewater treatment plant. All their water coming in is tested for PFAS. That way they can go upstream and find out where the sources are, what the problems are going to be, and how to eliminate them. This way they keep it out of the biosolids. They also have another thing, if you notice at the bottom, they have an MPDS limit of 12 parts per trillion, which means no one can discharge into a surface water body under an MPDS permit without testing for PFAS. So I think these are some of the things that Florida needs to look at doing to kind of get ahead of this before it becomes so untenable that we've ruined our drinking water, that we're having trouble with our surface water, and it becomes a huge, bigger and bigger problem. So why are we here? We talked about outreach. So especially in the past couple of years, you've seen how outreach and how social media has just kind of went kaboom. And this is Aaron Brockovich had written an article, an opinion article, based on a book by an epidemiologist from Mount Sinai, and basically says, look, we're seeing sperm count decrease, and we're attributing it to PFAS, PFOAs, and we're attributing it to these chemicals in the environment. So Aaron Brockovich took that book, wrote an opinion piece on it, made it popular, showed up in everybody's social media. So these are things that we're going to have to start looking at, that people are going to start coming at the regulators and at us going, hey, what are you doing about this? If this is causing these problems in our environment and with our health, we can no longer say, yeah, you know, and here's another comment I get a lot. We don't have enough data. And I'm like, and a few weeks ago when I was getting information for this talk together, I found an article. Since about the year 2000 up until about 2017, there have been over 15,000 scientific journal articles published on PFAS. And that they cover the topic, everything you can think of. So there is data there. There's information there. There's a lot of good data there. You know, you tie all these things into the surface water. You know, you talked about, Jorge talked about storage. In my other job, we're looking at a lot of aquifer storage recovery. But we're not looking at the water quality that we're going to pump down there. Are we going to pump down there PFAS-laden water that we cannot figure out how we're going to treat. It's going to cost us 10 times more to treat it once we pump it out to figure out how to get the PFAS out of it. These are things we need to figure out now. As a last slide and a tie into the next section, this is, in the other part of social media. You may have not been getting these, but for about the past 6 months, I've been getting these about once every 2 weeks. In Facebook, I get a pop-up that says, hey, if you've been exposed to PFAS, if you have, call our law firm. So it's coming. It is like there. People are out there actively saying, if you've been exposed to this stuff, you can sue somebody. So at what point do the regulators become responsible? At what point do municipalities have to go, yeah, you know what, we better look at our wastewater treatment plant. We better look at our water system to make sure we don't have PFAS in it. Because at some point, people are going to go, why didn't you do something about this? If you look at Flint, Michigan, a prime example, like, how did that happen? You're supposed to have a well-run, regulated water utility, and you had no idea what was going on. So here we are with a wonderful compound called PFAS. These are some references. There's the one at the bottom is particularly good. It's a preprint. It's not even out and published yet. It's long-term leaching of PFAS from contaminated agricultural fields. It was a study done in Germany where they looked at this field that had been PFAS or had biosolids land applied for about 15 years and did an evaluation of what they were seeing. And they're seeing that, yes, it migrates vertically from the biosolids into the soil profile, into the groundwater. It does run off. So it's a really good article. It's in Journal of Contaminant Hydrology. Anyway, I think that's it. Let me see. Yep. Thank you.
Brad, thank you so much. That was a great way to wrap the panel up. Maybe you can stay at the microphone and help me field questions from the audience because I can't see those folks. But before we do that, we have one question that's pending online. This is primarily, I think, for Teresa, if you're still with us. I see that you are. If you could unmute your microphone. Does the department have any recommended mitigation for known PFAS issues? It's a very good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. And I will say that, no, we don't recommend or endorse any particular type of remedial technology. There are a number of resources out there that are available that might be helpful to you. ITRC has a really good document with some various types of remediation technologies. And unfortunately, as you've probably heard, or you may hear about the rest of the conference, there's really not a lot of options out there. So yeah, I wouldn't endorse any one particular technology over the other.
Thank you. Brad, anyone out there in the audience who would like to ask questions?
Questions? Yes, we do have one.
Yes, wanted to ask you the question about funding. Is there going to be funding by the FDP, EPA, or somewhere to be able to do the PFAS sampling and remediation?
So I can speak for DEP. I certainly can't speak for the federal government. Although I did hear earlier today on a call with EPA that some of the new proposals for next year that are going to be presented under the Biden administration may include some funding for PFAS, but as of now, there's not anything that I'm aware of, and certainly at the state, we don't really have any programs that provide any sort of funding assistance at this point in time.
Let me handle that for a second too.
Thank you.
So in the state budget, I will tell you there is one reference. It's not significant, but it's there to PFAS sampling. I'm not certain that the funding goes directly to a municipality or goes through DEP, but if you do a search in the budget, which will finalize tomorrow, I think you'll find one reference. I can imagine that next year's budget will be tenfold that. But at EPA, if you look at the WIFIA, WIFIA came out, their latest round is open, I think it was yesterday or the day before, through July 25th or June 25th. You can reference, you can look online and see. They do have a criteria where you win points for emerging contaminants, addressing emerging contaminants, which essentially is shorthand for PFAS. So, you know, at the federal government level, at EPA, and I encourage you, EPA answers the phone when you call to ask them. I think that you could probably get some assistance from them, especially on large scale water treatment, water quality projects through the WIFIA program, if not others.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there that through the EPA program and the Clean Water Act, there are state revolving fund dollars that go to every state, and there are limits that are put out. The EPA put out another $1.3 billion this year that gets distributed to the different states on that, and a certain amount of the percentage also is slated for suburban small water treatment systems and companies, and that can be used in a number of different fashions, including design, treatment, equipment, sampling, and upgrades. So they're through your state revolving fund, Clean Water Act, provided through the EPA, are mechanisms for the water systems to be able to get funding.
I'd like to add that in terms of funding, separate and apart from what may be available in terms of direct grants or loans from the federal government or the state through the federal government, there is the Florida Brownfields program, which provides for various forms of funding for parties that want to voluntarily assume site rehabilitation responsibilities. On the tax credit side, the Florida corporate income tax credit side, that funding, depending on how much money you ultimately spend on cleanup and the end use involved with the project, could produce a 67.5% cash on cash return up to a 90% cash on cash return. And then again, depending on the end use, specifically affordable housing, there is the possibility of a 100% sales tax refund on construction materials. We represent a number of affordable housing developers across the state, and that incentive has produced in the high six figures to the low seven figures in terms of a cash refund, depending on the magnitude of the project. And then finally, if the end use also creates significant job counts, there is a very nice tax cash refund for job creation, which can add to the bottom line and help provide a nice subsidy for the cost of cleanup. There is a question that's pending in the chat room. There's a gentleman who said that the data from the last slide demonstrated bioaccumulation with respect to these contaminants. He's now not so much bioaccumulation, but biomagnification. And the question is, in light of that, we've lost the chain here. Will DEP be advising about the potential health impacts of eating seafood that may be contaminated with PFAS in surface water?
So let me first start by saying that DEP would not typically be the agency that would issue a fish advisory. That would typically come from the Department of Health. With that being said, I am not aware of any efforts to identify any fish advisories related to PFAS in the state of Florida.
Very good, thank you.
We have a question.
Brett, thanks for a great presentation. My question is, you mentioned about the breakdown of PFAS. Could you elaborate a little bit about what kind of breakdown we're talking about here? And is there a known mechanism of the breakdown? Thank you.
Well, yes. So some of what are called precursors, some of the compounds, PFHX, PFHXS, XA. Some of those compounds are being discovered that they break down into PFOA, PFOS. Again, I'm didn't review that. I mean, that's like a whole nother 2 days of talking. But what's happening in the environment, that's why a lot of states are starting to regulate, like Michigan are starting to regulate other things other than PFOA, PFOS, because they're realizing that we need to know how much, you know, PFBS is in the sample, because that is something that's likely to be breaking down into PFOA, PFOS, and causing exceedances. So that's one thing to consider when you're evaluating site. I have a few sites that you know, I'm trying to figure out where the PFOS is coming from. I know where some of it's coming from, but then I have, you know, on one side I have PFOA, PFOS, on the other, where's the PFOA coming from? You know, so it's very new, you know, but there's getting to be quite a bit of research. And to touch on that, so here's the problem we're having with some of it is the distribution coefficients, and I'm not going to bore you with all that, but so the distribution coefficients are varying depending who's doing the research, and I think that's something that needs to be worked on. And I think people are realizing that we don't have a good KD value for some of these compounds. So, yes.
Yeah, real quick on that. There's a whole series of fluorotelomers, like
Yes.
8,2-FTS, 6,2-F2S. Those compounds will break down naturally, right, into then the stable PFAS compounds. And there is an analysis, top assay, your total oxidizable precursor, that you can have run, and basically they oxidize the sample, or half of it. The other half they run regularly, and you oxidize those precursors and turn them into then the more stable PFAS that you may not have found. And it is, you can talk to the laboratories out here. A number of them run that. It is a very useful analysis, and there's some presentations that we could share with you, you know, on that as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Perfect.
Hi, I probably have more of a comment than a question, a little bit of both. So I'm an elected official over in the city of Satellite Beach over on the East Coast. And we are right next to Patrick Air Force Base, who is the third most contaminated DoD site within all their facilities. And I'd like to say that as far as the communication, I heard about this PFAS summit. We weren't invited to that, by the way. Nobody came and talked to us. And by the way, Erin Brockovich came to my city. Nobody wants to see Erin Brockovich in their city. And trust me, she offered a bunch of fear mongering, lawyers, you know, that type of a thing to us. We decided prior to her even coming that we drilled on our own without any sort of support from anyone. We're a small city. We have 5 monitoring wells that we put in at multiple levels, and we've regulated them, and we've done testing with very little help. My bigger question, I suppose, is it's more of a comment. I've been to DC, I've been to Tallahassee, rallying to try to get regular regulations that we can actually present to the communities so that they can understand when should they be scared? Should they be scared? What should they be scared of? Can they eat the fish? Can they not eat the fish? And what we're running into, and I haven't been able to find anyone here yet, is we are trying to test the fish in our lagoon. And it's been very difficult for us to find any companies that will do those testing. Either they're hesitant because we're not very big, or it's too expensive. So if anybody knows anyone that's willing to help us out, and also to help us get some good regulations. And also, if you need any help, I am always willing to come. I would have come to that summit in a heartbeat. And I don't know, that's pretty much all I had to say.
Talk to the labs that are here, because they do bioassay, and they can
Okay.
perform the analysis.
Yeah,
Thank
when
you.
you're doing the fish samples, what you have to discern against is whether you're going to do the whole fish, or you're going to do certain organs, or just a tissue and the fatty section as far as the portion that you're going to eat. So depending on if you're doing it for human, then you're usually just using the tissue part. That if you're looking at the total fish that then a larger fish or an animal would do, then they end up doing the whole fish. But the labs out here, they do that process. You just need to make sure you identify and talk to the project manager or the lab of what you want to use the data for, and they'll help you make sure you do the right analyses and right procedure for it.
Do we know if there's any broad scale studies done as far as, I know I heard a little bit today about there being some studies with the food chain, but do we know, is there any?
If you look at the references in my talk at the end, if you look up those references, those are studies where they have taken fish and alligators and looked at blood serum, and they looked at different things and evaluated. So that would be a good starting point to help you kind of figure out how to look at that.
All right, thank you.
And thank you. I mean, and that's one thing I wanted to mention, that, you know, when I was talking about the need for regulations, I guess that's kind of where I was going, is that our regulators do need to kind of come forth with some plan, some regulations on PFAS and start, because there's getting to be more and more questions in the community about PFAS and what is the risk. So, and that's exactly what Jorge had brought up, is like, you know, we need to start being able to understand this from a regulatory, what is safe, what is not safe. So anyway, yes.
This question is for Teresa. And I noticed you have that lovely map with all the certified firefighting facilities, firefighter training facilities, all mapped out. Do you have any, does the DEP or do you have any plans for non-certified or private firefighter facilities?
Not at this time. So I mentioned that we are working on the certified fire training facilities. We're also now stepping into the former certified fire training facilities. It is in our dynamic plan that we know that other private fire training facilities and other fire stations sort of are a potential source. So it's possible that at some point in the future, we could go down that path and start investigating those facilities, but we don't have any immediate plans to do that.
We have Roy on the line. Roy, go ahead.
I believe Roy already spoke.
Okay. Oh, we do have another question.
Okay, yeah, I do have can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question probably for John or Jorge. And from your experience, you know, from state or federal regulatory standpoint, do you foresee EPA will kind of decrease the level less than 70 ppt during the MCL development? Wow, particularly, you know,
that's a tough
state
question.
of California, Illinois recently
Yeah.
used the new loop
Well,
data.
let me answer it this way. So I said, you know, I'm a scientist of a different kind, a political scientist, and you'd be naive not to think politics was involved in this. And so from that perspective, I do think that, you know, there's a higher potential under the current administration for there to be a more stringent evaluation, perhaps to match some of the states that share the same scientific and values outlooks that the current administration does, like Michigan and like California. I believe it will be a challenge for the EPA to act in 4 years or even 8 years in order to get that done. So it's clear they're starting now, though, right? They're less than 100 days in and they're on top of PFAS. So, you know, I believe that obviously I don't have any, you know, I'm not sitting at the table as I was 3 years ago, but I would, my gut tells me and my political instincts tell me that would be their mark, right? And that they're gonna try to hit it. And they're probably going to try to hit it in the next 3 years. Try.
Thank you. That's a good question. I think for right now, the 70 parts per trillion is here to stay until the EPA comes with either a higher or lower number. And a number that has to survive challenges, both in courts and all that. But what we know now, it's 70 parts per trillion is the number that's a de facto standard that everybody's looking at.
Yeah.
Surface water is different, but then again, for surface water, it's a more holistic approach. You know, what do you do once you detect numbers in surface water that exceed that non-enforceable number? And it can range from, you know, tissue studies to basically not doing anything right now because it's not an enforceable number. But ultimately, as Brad said, I mean, it's a more holistic approach that we need, both, you know, in collaboration with DEP and everybody else. How do we begin to approach this hugely societal problem that's affecting everybody? You know, and how do we approach the different media, you know, surface water, soil, sediment, et cetera, et cetera. But hey, here we are, you know, we survived the PCE days, the TCE days, all those recalcitrants, and here we are with a new recalcitrant again. So careers will be built on this, and careers will, you know, a lot of young folks that are out there, you know, your careers will be built on this for sure.
Yeah. And if you're curious on how different states have come up with different numbers, Florida followed the EPA method where we calculated it based on certain parameters, mice, that sort of thing. California looked at mitochondrial DNA and how PFAS affects the DNA. So they came up with a much lower number than other states. So it's all based on what they use for the reference dose and how they calculate those numbers. So I think, you know, and I think Jorge is right, until the EPA changes how they calculate the risks, 70 is going to be 70. So unless the state comes up with their own. So.
And I'll just make a comment that hasn't really been mentioned yet, but you realize that PFOA and PFOS, the two compounds that have the health advisory limits, we did phase out in 2000, 2002, and 2008. So we're catching up to what has already been produced and released. And we have all these newer compounds that we're just going to, in the very forefront of starting to learn about. So it's not as though these compounds, the two main ones, are being produced at quantities today.
One more question?
Yeah, as a final question then. I was wondering, has anybody taken a look at smaller sites, which would be, you have a fire at a facility and then the fire gets put out? You know, if AAAF was used there, you know, are people looking at those sites to see whether or not there's impacts to soil or groundwater?
On brownfield sites, the answer to that is yes. Different states then are looking at those going back, and specifically if they're finding groundwater or wells that are impacted and then working their way back. There's a site in Pennsylvania that sort of very popular. That was a tire facility and had a big fire and was put out. It got redeveloped. Nobody knew it, and the property owner there is the one the DEP is trying to hold responsible for the plume that has now left that property for many years now. So the answer to it is yes, to a certain degree.
Yeah, I guess my concern, the reason that I bring that up is, as you do in due diligence for a client, you know, if they have a facility that's had a fire, do they then have the liability of what has happened there with respect to the fire being put out? Who does that liability fall on? And that's probably a question for the following session. But thank you.
Yeah, there's a number of lawsuits that are looking at that. But understand too is the foam, the AFFF foam was specifically made for high intensity fires and was not used for normal fires and things like that. So it was really made for you know, your jet fuels, your refineries, your very high volatile compounds.
What about if you have an industrial facility? Because, you know, sometimes we have an industrial facility that's going to have a fire. Would that fall into the category that you're explaining as well?
What we do when we look and find out historically that there has been a fire, we then try to go back and find out if that fire department, or find out who responded, and then find out whether or not they use that. And a lot of times we can dig deep enough to find out where their fire training centers were and find out if they actually had that capability or not. And you do have to go back to see who actually responded, because a lot of times if it was a really big fire, the local company came, but it was an emergency response county one that had the foam and came and then really did the major put out with the foam.
Yeah, and also consider what the fire was, whether it was petroleum or solvent. You know, those are the most likely uses of AFFF.
Gene, I think that about does it.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Great session. Great session. We're going to take a 30-minute break. Thank you, panelists. And then we're going to come back and kind of see a session that kind of sparked my whole interest in this, and that is the legal issues. And so I think that's going to open up a lot of people's eyes in this next session. So come on back in 30 minutes.